The rain fell like broken glass over the streets of Lower Manhattan that November evening, turning the asphalt into black mirrors that reflected nothing but shadows. The city had a way of swallowing sound during storms like this, muffling sirens, drowning out shouts, making even screams feel distant and unimportant, but one voice cut through the downpour with a clarity that stopped time itself. A little girl stood on the rain-slicked steps of San Luca Hospital, her pink raincoat plastered against her small frame, clutching a worn teddy bear to her chest. Tears mixed with rainwater on her face as she looked up at the towering figures blocking the entrance. Her voice cracked with desperation as she cried out to anyone who would listen. Those men wouldn't let her mother into the hospital. Those men with their dark suits and cold eyes were keeping her mother outside, bleeding, dying. Inside the emergency bay, Maria Conti lay on a stretcher that hadn't moved in 12 minutes. The EMTs stood frozen, their hands still gripping the metal rails, their faces tight, with a fear that had nothing to do with medical emergencies. The woman's abdomen was wrapped in blood-soaked gauze, her breathing shallow and labored. The car accident had been bad, a T-bone collision at the intersection of Mulberry and Grand. Her sedan crumpled like paper against a delivery truck. But the accident wasn't what was killing her now. The delay was. Two men in expensive suits flanked the ambulance doors. Their arms crossed, their presence more effective than any locked gate. They weren't hospital security. Everyone knew that. These were enforcers from the Torino family, one of the 5 organizations that carved up the city like a Thanksgiving turkey. And Maria Conti, as it turned out, was married to a man who had made the catastrophic mistake of skimming money from their drug operations in Queens. The message was clear. No treatment, no mercy. Not for her or anyone connected to her husband's betrayal. The little girl, Sophia, barely 6 years old, didn't understand territories or debts or the brutal mathematics of street justice. She only understood that her mother was hurt, that the hospital was right there, and that the men in suits wouldn't move. She had run from the ambulance when the EMTs hesitated, her small legs carrying her up those wet stone steps, screaming for help that wouldn't come. The night nurses watched from behind glass doors. The doctors pretended not to see. This was how things worked in this part of the city. You didn't interfere with family business. You didn't ask questions. You certainly didn't challenge men who carried that particular look in their eyes, the look that said human life was just another commodity to be traded or discarded. Then the sound of engines cut through the rain. 3 black SUVs rolled up to the hospital entrance with the precision of a military convoy, their headlights slicing through the storm like searchlights. The vehicles moved as one unit, forming a semicircle that blocked the street entirely. For a moment, everything stopped. The enforcers tensed, hands moving instinctively toward concealed weapons. The EMTs pressed themselves against the ambulance. Even the rain seemed to pause in anticipation of what came next. The rear door of the center SUV opened, and a man stepped out into the downpour. Rafael DeSantis didn't hurry. He never hurried. At 43, he moved with the controlled grace of someone who understood that power wasn't about speed, it was about inevitability. His charcoal suit absorbed the rain without seeming to notice it. His dark hair swept back from a face that could have belonged to a Roman senator or a Renaissance prince, but his eyes told a different story. They were the color of winter steel, empty of warmth, filled with a cold calculation that had built an empire on fear and precision. He was the head of the DeSantis organization, the largest and most ruthless of the city's criminal networks. His name alone could empty rooms or fill cemeteries. Judges took his calls. Prosecutors lost evidence. Rival families negotiated borders with him like he was a sovereign nation. And when Rafael DeSantis walked into a situation, the situation changed. He looked down at the small figure on the steps, the little girl with the teddy bear and the tear-streaked face, and something flickered behind those steel eyes. Something that might have been recognition or memory, or perhaps just the faintest echo of humanity that hadn't yet been completely erased by decades of violence. Sophia looked up at him, her voice hoarse from screaming. She pointed a trembling finger at the men blocking the hospital entrance and told him what she had told everyone else. Those men wouldn't let her mother in. Her mother was hurt. Her mother needed help. Please! Rafael turned his attention to the Torino enforcers. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, it was barely above a conversational tone, but every word carried the weight of an executioner's blade. He asked them a simple question. Were they aware whose territory they were standing in? The men shifted uncomfortably. Lower Manhattan belonged to DeSantis. Everyone knew that. But the Torino family had believed their message was more important than geography, that their vendetta against Maria Conti's husband transcended the usual boundaries. They had miscalculated. Within seconds, Rafael's bodyguards emerged from the SUVs, 6 men in identical dark coats, moving with synchronized efficiency. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was weapon enough. The Torino enforcers found themselves surrounded, outmaneuvered, their hands carefully moved away from their jackets as Rafael's men disarmed them with professional courtesy that somehow felt more threatening than violence would have been. Rafael walked past them without another glance, his rain-soaked coat trailing behind him like a cape, water dripping from his shoulders onto the hospital's pristine floors. The automatic doors opened as if in deference to his arrival. The nurses at the reception desk looked up and immediately looked away. The security guard at the metal detector stepped aside before being asked. He found the hospital administrator in his office on the 2nd floor, reviewing charts with the kind of focused intensity that vanished the moment Rafael appeared in the doorway. The administrator, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, and the perpetually nervous demeanor of someone who had spent his career avoiding conflict, started to speak, started to explain about insurance and protocols, and the complicated situation unfolding in the emergency bay. Rafael interrupted him with a single sentence. Maria Conti would receive immediate treatment from the hospital's best trauma surgeon. Every resource would be made available. The cost was irrelevant. And if there were any delays, any hesitations, any further complications, the administrator would find himself explaining his decisions to people far less patient than Rafael. The administrator reached for his phone with trembling hands. 20 minutes later, Maria Conti was in surgery. The bullet fragments from a 9mm, evidence of a drive-by shooting that had preceded the car accident, details that were only now coming to light, were being removed by a surgeon who had been enjoying his evening off until his phone rang, with an urgency that suggested his career depended on his immediate presence. Rafael sat in the surgical waiting room, an incongruous figure among the worried families and crying children. His bodyguards stood at strategic positions, by the elevators, near the stairwells, watching the entrances with the vigilance of Secret Service agents. Other families gave him a wide berth, sensing something dangerous in his stillness, in the way he sat perfectly motionless, with his hands folded in his lap, staring at nothing. Sophia sat beside him, her teddy bear clutched to her chest, her small body dwarfed by the plastic waiting room chair. She had stopped crying, but her eyes were red and swollen, her pink raincoat still dripping onto the linoleum floor. She looked up at the man who had made the scary men go away, who had walked into the hospital like he owned it, who had somehow made everything start moving again. She asked him why he had helped them. Her voice was small and uncertain, the question of a child trying to understand an adult world that made no sense. Rafael looked down at her, and for a moment something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite softness, men like him didn't do soft, but it was something close to recognition. He told her that some things shouldn't happen, even in a city as hard as this one. Children shouldn't have to watch their mothers die on hospital steps because of men with guns and grudges. Some lines, he said, shouldn't be crossed. She didn't fully understand his words, but she understood his tone. She leaned against his arm. This stranger in the expensive suit who smelled like rain and cologne and something else she couldn't identify, and closed her eyes. The surgery lasted 3 hours. The surgeon emerged looking exhausted but satisfied, reporting that Maria Conti would survive. The internal bleeding had been extensive, but they had stopped it in time. She would need weeks of recovery, possibly months, but she would live. Rafael stood buttoning his jacket with the same precision he applied to everything. He left instructions with his men. Maria and her daughter would have private security until further notice, a detail that would rotate shifts but never leave them unprotected. The Torino family would receive a message that evening, one that made clear the consequences of operating in his territory without permission. And Maria's husband, wherever he was currently hiding, would be located and brought in for a conversation about responsibility and the protection of family. But before he left the hospital, Rafael returned to the surgical floor one final time. Maria had been moved to a private room, the best the hospital had, with a view of the city lights and equipment that looked like it belonged in a spaceship. She was awake, groggy from anesthesia but conscious, her hand reaching instinctively for her daughter's when Sophia ran to her bedside. She looked up at Rafael standing in the doorway. This man whose face she had seen on news reports and whispered about in her neighborhood. This criminal, this monster, this devil that mothers warned their children about. She asked him the same question her daughter had asked. Why would someone like him help someone like her? Rafael was quiet for a long moment, watching the reunion between mother and daughter, watching Sophia climb carefully onto the hospital bed and curl against her mother's side with the teddy bear squashed between them. He thought about his own mother, decades dead now, who had bled out in a tenement apartment while he was 8 years old because no ambulance would come to their neighborhood fast enough. He thought about the little boy he had been, crying on those steps, screaming for help that never arrived. He told Maria that children shouldn't have to cry like that. Not even in his world. Especially not in his world. Then he turned and walked out of the room, his bodyguards falling into formation around him, the hospital staff parting like the Red Sea as he made his way to the elevators and out into the rain-soaked night. The next morning, the 2 Torino enforcers who had blocked the hospital entrance were found in an abandoned warehouse in Red Hook. They were alive, barely, but the message was clear. They would never work in this city again. Their boss received a phone call that lasted less than 30 seconds, a conversation that ended with an apology and assurances that such territorial violations would never be repeated. Maria's husband turned himself into the police 2 days later, confessing to embezzlement charges that would put him away for 15 years. It was, the prosecutors noted, an unusually cooperative surrender from a man who had been running successfully for 3 weeks. What they didn't know was that Rafael's men had located him in a motel in Pennsylvania and given him a choice: face the legal system or face DeSantis justice. He chose prison. In the weeks that followed, Maria recovered in her hospital room with her daughter by her side and guards at her door that she had never requested but couldn't dismiss. When she was finally released, she found that her apartment rent had been paid for the year, that Sophia's school tuition was mysteriously covered, that medical bills totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars had been settled by an anonymous benefactor. She never saw Rafael DeSantis again, but she heard the stories. Everyone in the neighborhood heard the stories. The devil of Lower Manhattan, they called him. The man whose word was law and whose mercy was as rare as snow in summer. Yet on one rain-soaked November night, that same devil had done something that looked remarkably like salvation. Sophia kept her teddy bear on her bed, and sometimes at night, when the rain fell against her window, she would remember the man in the dark suit who had made everything okay. She would remember his quiet voice and his steel eyes, and the way everyone moved when he walked into a room. She would remember that her mother was alive because he had decided she should be. Years later, When Sophia was grown and the city had changed in ways both large and small, she would sometimes walk past San Luca Hospital and look at those stone steps where she had once stood crying in the rain. She would think about that night and wonder about the strange mathematics of goodness and evil, about how the worst men sometimes did the best things, about how a single moment of unexpected mercy could ripple outward and change everything. The city kept its secrets, the rain kept falling, and somewhere in the shadows of Lower Manhattan, a man named Rafael DeSantis continued building his empire on fear and precision, his reputation growing darker with each passing year. But those who had been there that November night, the nurses, the doctors, the security guards, even the other criminals who heard the story third hand, they all remembered one thing with perfect clarity. The devil himself had walked into that hospital, and for reasons no one could fully explain, he had chosen to do something holy. 15 years passed like smoke through the streets of Lower Manhattan, the city transforming and reinventing itself the way cities do, swallowing old memories and replacing them with new construction, new faces, new stories. But some memories refused to be buried beneath progress and time. Sophia Conti was 21 now, a junior at Columbia University, studying social work with a minor in criminal justice. She had her mother's dark eyes and delicate features, but there was something harder in her expression, something that came from growing up, knowing exactly how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could change on a rain-soaked hospital step. She worked part-time at a community center in the Lower East Side, helping families navigate the impossible maze of city bureaucracy, translating documents, filling out forms, being the voice for people who had learned that the system rarely listened to voices like theirs. Her mother had rebuilt their life with quiet determination. After her husband's imprisonment, Maria had refused to be defined by his mistakes or saved by mysterious benefactors. She worked 2 jobs for years, morning shifts at a bakery, evening shifts cleaning offices in Midtown, until she could afford to put herself through nursing school. Now she worked at Mount Sinai, helping other families through their worst moments, understanding their fear in ways that textbooks could never teach. They never spoke about that November night, not directly. It sat between them like a photograph neither wanted to examine too closely. The memory of rain and blood, and a man in a dark suit who had rewritten their fate with a few quiet words. Maria had made Sophia promise never to seek him out, never to try to thank him or repay a debt that couldn't be measured in any currency that mattered. Some doors, she warned, once opened, could never be closed again. But Sophia thought about him often. She thought about him every time she heard his name whispered in the neighborhood. Every time she saw a news report about another DeSantis operation shut down or another rival family absorbed into his expanding empire. Rafael DeSantis had become something more than human in the 15 years since that night. He was a myth, a ghost story, the monster under the bed that kept other monsters in line. The autumn wind carried the smell of roasting chestnuts and exhaust fumes as Sophia walked through Washington Square Park, cutting through the usual chaos of street performers and chess players and NYU students sprawled on blankets pretending to study. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Working late shift, leftovers in fridge, don't forget to lock the deadbolt. The same message, slight variations, that she had been receiving since she was 6 years old. Protection and caution had become her mother's love language. She was so focused on her phone that she almost didn't notice the man who fell into step beside her. He was younger than she expected. Maybe 30, dressed in a well-tailored suit that marked him as someone who existed in Rafael DeSantis's orbit even before he spoke. His face was professionally neutral, his voice polite but firm when he addressed her by name and asked if she would be willing to have a brief conversation with someone who had been hoping to speak with her. Sophia's first instinct was to run. Her second instinct was to call her mother, but something in the man's demeanor, a strange mixture of respect and inevitability, made her pause. She asked who wanted to speak with her, though she already knew the answer. The car was parked on Sullivan Street, the same model of black SUV that had appeared on that hospital step 15 years ago. The man opened the rear door with a gesture that was somehow both invitation and command. Sophia climbed inside, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind racing through every warning her mother had ever given her about staying away from that world. Rafael DeSantis sat in the far corner of the back seat, older now but not diminished by the years. His hair had threads of silver at the temples. His face carried new lines around the eyes, but that fundamental quality, that sense of controlled power of a man who had made himself into something larger than human, remained unchanged. He looked at her with those steel-colored eyes, and Sophia felt herself transported back to that waiting room. A little girl with a teddy bear sitting beside a stranger who had saved her mother's life. He spoke first, his voice the same quiet tone she remembered from childhood. He apologized for the dramatic nature of the meeting, but explained that he had been following her progress over the years, her education, her work at the community center, her careful construction of a life dedicated to helping others. He said he found it remarkable, this choice she had made to move toward people's suffering rather than away from it. Sophia found her voice, asking the question that had haunted her for 15 years. Why had he helped them that night? She was older now, understood more about the world and the way men like him operated. She knew that mercy wasn't random, that there was always calculation, always an angle. She wanted to know what they had unknowingly paid for their survival. Raphael was quiet for a long moment, looking out the tinted window at the park where students and tourists moved through their oblivious afternoons. He told her about his mother, a story he had shared with almost no one, how she had died because ambulances wouldn't come fast enough to their neighborhood, how he had stood on different steps, crying to different closed doors, how that 8-year-old boy had learned that power was the only currency that mattered, the only thing that could force the world to pay attention. He had built an empire on that lesson, he said, built it ruthlessly and efficiently, crushing anyone who stood in his way, accumulating power and fear and money until he had become untouchable. But power, he explained, was a strange currency. The more you had, the less it seemed to matter, until you found yourself sitting in the back of expensive cars, realizing you had won a game you no longer wanted to play. That night at the hospital, seeing Sophia on those steps, he had recognized something in her tears, a mirror of his own childhood, a chance to rewrite a story that had already been written in his own blood. He had helped them because for one moment he wanted to be the man he might have become if his mother had lived, if someone had been powerful enough to save her, if the world had been different. Sophia felt tears burning in her eyes, understanding more than she wanted to about pain and choices and the ways people tried to outrun their own histories. She asked him why he was telling her this now, after all these years of silence. Raphael explained that he was dying, pancreatic cancer, stage 4, maybe 6 months if the doctors were being optimistic. His empire would be divided among his lieutenants, his assets distributed, his legacy reduced to whatever stories people chose to remember. But before that happened, he wanted to tell her the truth, that saving her and her mother hadn't been calculation or strategy or some elaborate long game. It had been the one purely good thing he had done in a life full of necessary evils. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, old and yellowed with age. Inside was a photograph. A woman with Sophia's eyes and her mother's smile, young and beautiful, standing on a street corner in Little Italy decades before Sophia was born. Raphael's mother, he explained. Sophia looked so much like her that seeing her on those hospital steps had felt like stepping back through time. Sophia held the photograph with trembling hands, looking at the face of a woman who had died before she was born, but whose death had somehow saved her life through the complicated mathematics of trauma and memory, and a powerful man's one moment of unexpected grace. Rafael told her that the money he had spent on their apartment, Sophia's education, her mother's nursing school, he didn't want gratitude for that. He wanted her to understand that it wasn't debt or obligation. It was an investment in the possibility that goodness could exist, even in a city that seemed designed to crush it. Watching her choose to help others, to build a life dedicated to service rather than survival, had given him something he hadn't expected to find: hope that maybe one good act could ripple outward in ways he couldn't control or corrupt. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. When Sophia stepped out of the car, back onto Sullivan Street, the autumn sun was beginning to set, painting the buildings in shades of amber and rust. She stood on the sidewalk, the photograph still clutched in her hand, watching the black SUV disappear into traffic. She never told her mother about that meeting. Some truths were too heavy to share, too complicated to explain. But that night, she framed the photograph of Rafael's mother and placed it on her dresser beside a picture of her own mother and her childhood teddy bear. 3 generations of women, connected by rain and blood and a dying man's confession. Rafael DeSantis passed away 4 months later. The funeral was small and private, attended only by his closest associates and a priest who looked uncomfortable blessing a man whose sins could fill encyclopedias. The newspapers ran obituaries that focused on his criminal empire, his violent legacy, the estimated body count of his decades in power. But Sophia, reading those articles in her dorm room, thought about the man in the hospital waiting room, the stranger who had sat beside a frightened little girl and told her that some lines shouldn't be crossed. She thought about how a single choice, one moment of unexpected mercy, had changed everything, not just for her and her mother, but perhaps for him too. She went to his grave once, a week after the funeral, carrying flowers that seemed inadequate for everything she wanted to say. She stood in the cold November wind, the same kind of wind that had blown 15 years ago, and thanked him for the life he had given her, for the possibility he had protected, for choosing to be something other than what the world expected him to be. The city kept moving around her, indifferent to her grief for a man she barely knew but would never forget. And somewhere in the complicated space between justice and mercy, between evil and grace, Sophia understood that the world was rarely as simple as people wanted it to be, that sometimes devils did holy things and sometimes salvation came from the darkest places. She walked away from that grave, carrying the knowledge that she would spend the rest of her life trying to honor what he had given her, not with gratitude or debt, but with the same unexpected mercy he had shown on that rain-soaked November night, when a little girl cried and a dangerous man chose to listen.